German airbase officer vanished in 1944. 81 years later, his buried hangar was found. Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most extraordinary discoveries to emerge from the long shadow of the Second World War. A story that begins not in the archives of history, but in the mud and limestone of rural Austria, where a team of environmental engineers stumbled onto something they were absolutely not prepared to find. The date is September 14th, 2023. A small crew contracted by the Styrian regional government has been tasked with conducting a ground-penetrating radar survey near the town of Graz, in the rolling farmland southeast of the city's outer districts. The project is mundane by design. They're mapping subsurface drainage channels ahead of a planned agricultural irrigation expansion. Nobody on that team is looking for history. Nobody expects to find it. But at approximately 2 in the afternoon, a junior technician named Marcus Felder notices something peculiar on his radar readout. Below a thick layer of post-war fill material and nearly 2 decades of topsoil accumulation, the equipment is registering a void. Not a small one. A vast, hollow space stretching nearly 40 meters in one direction and an estimated 18 meters across. The dimensions are consistent with a single structure, something large, reinforced, and deliberately concealed. Felder flags his supervisor. Within the hour, the entire survey team has gathered around the anomaly. The depth reading indicates the roof of the structure sits roughly 4.5 meters beneath the surface. Whatever is down there has been buried for a very long time. Regional archaeologist Dr. Sabine Altman is contacted that same evening. She arrives the following morning, September 15th, accompanied by 2 assistants and a portable seismic scanner. Within 6 hours of her arrival, she is able to confirm what the radar only suggested. There is a large subterranean structure beneath this Styrian field, constructed from reinforced concrete, with internal voids suggesting multiple rooms or bays. The construction style and materials, she notes in her initial report, are consistent with mid-20th century military engineering. The excavation takes 11 days. Contractors use a combination of mechanical excavators and careful hand digging near the entrance points. On September 26, 2023, at roughly 11 in the morning, the edge of a concrete lintel breaks the surface. Clearing continues. By 4 that afternoon, workers have exposed what is unmistakably a sealed hangar entrance. 2 massive blast doors, constructed from reinforced steel, heavily corroded but structurally intact, sealed from the inside. The doors take 2 more days to open. What investigators find on September 28th will fuel 3 years of forensic research, international archival cooperation, and one of the most compelling missing person investigations ever conducted into a Second World War disappearance. Inside the hangar, because that is precisely what it is, a buried aircraft maintenance hangar measuring 41 meters in length and 17 meters in width, investigators discover a scene that defies easy explanation. The space contains the skeletal remains of what was once a Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter aircraft, partially disassembled. There are tool racks, maintenance logs, fuel drums, a rusted field stove, and in a sealed inner room accessible through a second steel door, a wooden desk. On that desk sits a leather satchel. The leather has partially deteriorated, but the contents are protected by a waxed canvas inner lining. Inside the satchel, a Luftwaffe officer's service book, designation Wehepass, bearing the name and photograph of one Hauptmann Friedrich Karl Brenner, born February 8, 1909 in Rosenheim, Bavaria. 2 Luftwaffe identity discs. A set of private correspondence, 12 letters in total, addressed to a woman named Elsa. A logbook covering the period from January 1943 through what appears to be October 1944. And at the very bottom of the satchel, wrapped in an oilcloth and tied with wax string, a set of travel documents, civilian travel documents, identity papers in the name of a man called Joseph Eichler. According to the official records of the German Luftwaffe, Hauptmann Friedrich Karl Brenner was killed in action on October 19, 1944, when his aircraft went down over the Eastern Front during a ground attack mission near Rzeszów in occupied Poland. He was declared dead. A death notice was filed. His name appears on a memorial in Rosenheim. But here is the official record, and here, buried 4.5 meters underground in a sealed hangar outside Graz, Austria, is something else entirely. If you want to see what investigators found when they opened that logbook, and what it reveals about one of the most audacious personal escapes of the entire war, make sure you hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Tonight we're exploring this together, from wherever you are, to this quiet field in Styria where the ground kept a secret for 81 years. To understand what was found in that buried hangar, we need to travel back to the beginning, to the life of the man whose identity documents were sealed inside it, and to the extraordinary circumstances that made his disappearance not only plausible, but, as investigators would eventually conclude, meticulously planned. Friedrich Karl Brenner was born on February 8, 1909 in Rosenheim, a mid-sized Bavarian town nestled on the Inn River, roughly 60 kilometers southeast of Munich. He was the second of 3 sons born to Heinrich Brenner, a civil engineer employed by the Bavarian State Railway Administration, and his wife Margarethe, née Halsinger, a schoolteacher. The Brenner household was prosperous without being wealthy, educated without being aristocratic, exactly the kind of middle-class German family that would produce, in the coming decades, a generation of technically skilled young men ideally suited for the demands of a mechanized war. From an early age, Friedrich Karl demonstrated an exceptional aptitude for mechanical systems. Neighbors and family friends remembered a boy who spent his free hours dismantling and reassembling anything he could get his hands on: clockwork mechanisms, bicycle gears, his father's automobile engine. By the time he was 16, he was assisting local mechanics on weekends. By 18, he had built, from salvaged parts, a functioning single-cylinder motorcycle. It ran well enough for him to ride it to Munich and back on a dare. He enrolled in the Technical University of Munich in 1927, studying aeronautical engineering at a time when German aviation was experiencing a fragile renaissance following the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. He graduated in 1931 with distinction, his thesis focusing on engine cooling systems for high-altitude aircraft. His professors described him in academic reviews as methodical, intuitive, and possessed of an almost obsessive attention to detail. He joined the newly forming Reichsluftwaffe in 1933, barely months after the National Socialist government came to power. His recruitment was almost entirely apolitical in motivation. Brenner wanted to fly, and more than that, he wanted to work with aircraft at a level of technical intimacy that civilian employment simply could not offer. He was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to a flight training school near Braunschweig. His competence as both a pilot and a technical officer was recognized quickly. By 1936, he had been promoted to Oberleutnant and transferred to a fighter training wing operating out of airfields near Nuremberg. He married Elsa Richter in April 1937. Elsa was 26, the daughter of a Nuremberg clockmaker, dark-haired and quietly intelligent according to photographs and the recollections of her sister, who survived the war and was interviewed by a Bavarian historian in 1978. The couple had 2 children in rapid succession, a son, Werner, born in September 1938, and a daughter, Ilse, born in January 1940. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, Brenner held the rank of Hauptmann, captain, and had been assigned to command the technical operations unit of a Jagdgeschwader operating out of occupied France. His role was not primarily combat flying, though he flew combat missions and accumulated 73 confirmed operational sorties by mid-1941. His primary function was as a base technical officer, responsible for the maintenance, repair, and operational readiness of the aircraft under his wing's command. In this capacity, he was, by all accounts, exceptional. Declassified files from the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, partially reviewed in 2019 as part of a broader digitization project, contained 17 separate commendations for Brenner's performance between 1939 and 1943. He was noted repeatedly for his ability to improvise solutions under battlefield conditions, keeping aircraft operational with improvised parts, training ground crews to execute complex maintenance procedures in the field, and developing a system of rotating maintenance schedules that significantly reduced aircraft downtime across his unit. He received the Eisernes Kreuz First Class, the Iron Cross First Class, in March 1942. His commanding officer at the time, Oberst Hans-Dieter Rauch, wrote in his assessment that Brenner was among the most technically gifted officers in the Geschwader, whose contribution to operational readiness cannot be overstated. In the summer of 1943, Brenner was transferred to a new posting that would define the final chapter of his official military career. He was assigned as the senior technical officer for Jagdgeschwader 52, one of the most storied fighter wings of the entire Luftwaffe, operating on the Eastern Front. JG-52 was, by 1943, fighting a losing battle against an increasingly well-equipped and numerically overwhelming Soviet Air Force. The unit was based at a series of temporary and semi-permanent airfields across Ukraine and southern Poland, shifting position constantly as the Eastern Front contracted. It was during this posting that the circumstances of Brenner's life began to darken in ways that, as investigators would much later argue, began to plant the seeds of his escape. In February 1944, during the Allied bombing campaign targeting German cities, an RAF raid struck Nuremberg. The Brenner family home, a rented house in the Gastenhof district where Elsa and the children had been living since Friedrich Karl's departure for the front, received a direct hit. Elsa Brenner and both children, Werner, aged 5, and Ilse, aged 4, were killed. Their deaths were recorded by the Nuremberg City Registry on February 22, 1944. The notification reached Brenner at his posting in occupied Poland approximately 2 weeks later. Contemporaries who knew him during this period, among them Unteroffizier Georg Haendel, a mechanic who survived the war and gave a recorded interview to a Bavarian radio program in 1961, described the change in Brenner after receiving the death notification as profound and immediate. He was never a warm man, Haendel recalled, but he had a certainty about him, a sense of purpose. After the letter came, the certainty was still there, but the purpose had changed. You could see it. We all could. What that changed purpose ultimately became, that is the story this buried hangar has now, 81 years later, begun to tell. By October 1944, the Eastern Front had reached a state of cascading collapse for German forces. Soviet offensives had shattered the Wehrmacht's defensive lines across Poland and the Baltic states. Airfields that had been operational for months were being abandoned in days. The Luftwaffe's Eastern Front presence was fragmenting under the dual pressure of catastrophic losses and chronic fuel shortages. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, chaos. And chaos, as Friedrich Karl Brenner understood better than almost anyone, was the only environment in which a man with the right knowledge, the right preparation, and the right motivation could simply cease to exist. The official story is concise and tidy, as official stories often are. According to Luftwaffe operational records filed on October 20, 1944, Hauptmann Friedrich Karl Brenner, senior technical officer of Jagdgeschwader 52, was killed in action on the preceding day, October 19, 1944, when his aircraft, a Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, work number 730,452, bearing tactical marking Yellow 7, failed to return from a ground attack sortie targeting Soviet armored column movements near Rzeszów in what is now southeastern Poland. No wreckage was located. No body was recovered. The unit war diary, a document preserved in Freiburg, records the loss in 4 lines of standard administrative notation. Brenner is listed as Gefallen, fallen. But what the war diary does not record, what no official document ever could, is what was actually happening in the days and hours before that notation was made. Let us reconstruct what investigators now believe occurred, drawing on the contents of the logbook found in the hangar, forensic analysis of the documents in the satchel, and cross-referencing with declassified materials from the Austrian State Archive, the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, and the German Federal Archive. October 8, 1944. 11 days before his official death, the JG-52 forward operating base at a temporary airfield approximately 30 kilometers east of Rzeszów is in a state of near-constant movement. Soviet ground forces are advancing. The unit has received orders to prepare for relocation westward. Brenner, in his role as technical officer, has been authorizing the destruction of non-transportable equipment, standard procedure for a retreating unit. He has also, investigators now believe, been doing something else. The logbook recovered from the Styrian hangar contains entries through October 8 written in what forensic document analysts at the Austrian Federal Criminal Investigation Office confirmed, following examination in January 2024, is consistent with Brenner's known handwriting. The October 8 entry, partially damaged but largely legible, references what appears to be a pre-planned inventory check of a secondary facility. The location given is rendered in an abbreviated form, but the partial text reads clearly enough to identify a reference to a site near Graz, specifically to a privately owned agricultural property that Brenner had apparently visited during a leave period in late 1943. October 10, 1944. 2 days later, the war diary of JG-52 records that Brenner filed a routine request for a supply transport flight to carry maintenance parts westward, citing the imminent base relocation. The request was approved. A Junkers Ju-52 transport, the Luftwaffe's workhorse cargo aircraft, was allocated and scheduled to depart on October 12th. The flight was logged as carrying spare engine components and instrument packages. Cargo weighed approximately 800 kilograms. Investigators examining the Styrian hangar found something noteworthy in the inner room alongside the desk: 4 empty wooden crates stamped with Luftwaffe supply depot markings. The dimensions of those crates are consistent with the transport manifest logged for the Ju-52 flight. The crates, forensic analysis confirmed in March 2024, contain traces of aircraft instrument components, but also, crucially, traces of something else. Behind the fuel drums in the main hangar bay, investigators found a cache of 23 gold bars, each approximately 250 grams, bearing marks consistent with the Reichsbank gold reserves that were being dispersed across Greater Germany during this period, as the war's end became increasingly apparent. The gold had been packed in those crates. Brenner, using his authority as technical officer to authorize cargo manifests, had smuggled nearly 6 kilograms of gold onto a routine supply flight destined for a location he had pre-selected and pre-prepared. October 13, 1944, approximately 7 a.m. Brenner boards the Ju-52 at the eastern Polish airfield. The flight manifest shows him listed as an accompanying officer, which was not unusual for technical officers transporting sensitive equipment. The aircraft departs. It lands, according to records, at an airfield near Vienna, offloads part of its cargo, then continues to a secondary stop. The secondary stop is listed in the flight log as Graz-Thallerhof Airfield. Current records at the Austrian Aviation Authority confirm that Thallerhof was an active Luftwaffe logistics node in October 1944. What happened at Thalerhof is where the official trail ends and the physical evidence begins. The cargo, or at least the 4 crates, was unloaded. And then, investigators believe Brenner made his first disappearance, not into death, but into the surrounding countryside. The property where the hangar was built sits approximately 12 kilometers from Thalerhof. It was registered, according to Austrian land registry records researched by the investigation team in September 2023, to a Styrian farming family named Winkler. Specifically, to one Anton Winkler, a farmer born 1881. But in the margin of the 1943 land registry annotation, a fact discovered by archival researcher Dr. Christine Bergman of the University of Graz during a visit to the Styrian State Archive in November 2023. There is a notation indicating a co-tenancy arrangement with a technical contractor, whose name has been partially obscured by what appears to be a deliberate ink application. Partial letter forms visible under ultraviolet light analysis are consistent with the initials FKB. Friedrich Karl Brenner had not merely fled to a hiding place. He had, months in advance, arranged and paid for the construction of one. October 13th through October 18th, 1944. During this approximate 6-day window, Brenner is absent from all official unit records. This absence is unremarkable in the chaos of the retreat period, officers moving between facilities, communications interrupted by Soviet interdiction, administrative records lagging days behind events. His name does not appear in any duty roster, meal log, or communication record during this period. At the time, no one notices. The unit is fighting for its life. On October 19th, the scheduled date of the fateful sortie, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 bearing the marking yellow 7 does, indeed, take off from the eastern Polish airfield. What the official record does not specify, and what investigators were unable to definitively establish, is who was flying it. The aircraft was listed as Brenner's assigned aircraft. But the unit's own informal records, personal diaries and letters from surviving members that were reviewed by Polish archivists in 2022, suggest that by October 19th, Brenner had not been physically present at the base for at least several days. The aircraft that disappeared that morning may have been flown by someone else, or it may have been flown with deliberate intent to crash or abandon as the final prop in a carefully staged disappearance. The logbook found in the Styrian hangar ends on October 8th, but tucked inside its back cover, folded twice, investigators found a single handwritten note, undated, 2 sentences. The aircraft will not return. This is not the end of Friedrich Karl Brenner. It is the end of everything that bound him here. How the hangar came to exist is, in some ways, the most remarkable element of the entire story. The underground construction was not improvised. Ground-penetrating radar analysis conducted by the University of Graz's Civil Engineering Department in October 2023 reveals a structure built with professional-grade expertise. The concrete is consistent with formulations used in Luftwaffe field construction manuals from 1942. The blast door hardware matches specifications used in dispersal field shelters built across Austria and southern Germany during 1943 and 1944, as the Luftwaffe increasingly moved aircraft underground to protect them from Allied bombing. Brenner, as a senior technical officer with extensive experience in field construction and maintenance facility management, would have had detailed knowledge of exactly how such structures were built, and critically, how they were approved and funded through Luftwaffe logistics channels without attracting undue scrutiny. A dispersal shelter on private farmland, officially registered as a component of a regional air defense network, would have generated paperwork, but paperwork was abundant and attention was scarce in wartime Austria. The partially disassembled FW-190 found inside is, investigators believe, not a coincidence. It is a workshop, a camouflage, and a resource simultaneously, An aircraft that never flies but is never officially recorded as destroyed generates no questions. And a man with an intimate knowledge of Focke-Wulf fighter mechanics could, theoretically, maintain and potentially fly it if the need arose. Whether the aircraft was ever intended to be used for a second escape, or was simply stored there as an asset, remains an open question. September 28, 2023, the day the blast doors open. Dr. Sabine Altman and her team enter the Styrian hangar for the first time at approximately 10:30 in the morning. They are wearing protective equipment. The sealed environment, while structurally intact, has accumulated organic vapors and particulate matter from decades of sealed decomposition. The air quality inside, when first measured, reads as low in oxygen content. They work in shifts of 20 minutes initially, ventilating the space before extending their operational periods. The inner room, the one containing the desk, the satchel, and what will prove to be the most significant documentary evidence cache to emerge from a World War II site in years, is not accessed until the afternoon of September 29th, after the outer hangar has been photographed, cataloged, and partially cleared. When the second steel door opens, Altman later tells a colleague in an email that will be quoted in the official investigation summary. It was like opening a letter that had been waiting to be delivered for 80 years. Everything was exactly as it had been left. The satchel and its contents are removed under full forensic protocol. Everything is transported to the Institute of Forensic Science at the University of Graz within 36 hours of discovery. The document analysis. By November 2023, a forensic document examination team led by Dr. Werner Huber, a specialist in historical document authentication with prior experience analyzing recovered Nazi-era materials, has completed an initial assessment of the documents from the satchel. Airbase, the service book, is genuine. Authentication tests confirm that the paper stock, ink composition, and printing techniques are entirely consistent with officially issued Luftwaffe service documents from the 1943-1944 period. The photograph affixed to the service book shows a man in Luftwaffe officer's uniform, and while the photograph quality is consistent with wartime documentation standards, it is sufficiently detailed to allow facial comparison analysis. That analysis, conducted using photogrammetric methods developed for forensic age progression applications and applied to historical photographs, was performed by a specialist team from Vienna's Institute of Criminal Science in January 2024. The conclusion: the individual in the Airbase photograph is consistent with being the same individual visible in two other confirmed photographs of Friedrich Karl Brenner held in the German Federal Archive. One a unit photograph from 1941, the other an individual portrait from a 1942 commendation ceremony. The travel documents in the name of Joseph Eichler were a different challenge. Forensic examination confirms they are not original issue documents, but rather expertly produced forgeries, or, more precisely, what forensic specialists classify as semi-authentic documents. This category describes documents that use genuine official blank forms, acquired through theft or bribery from official sources, filled in with false information, and authenticated with real ink stamps rather than reproductions. The stamp impressions on the Eichler documents, analyzed under scanning electron microscope at the Institute of Forensic Science in February 2024, are genuine Styrian provincial administrative stamps from the 1944-1945 period. Someone with access to official administrative materials and a knowledge of how documents were processed had created an identity for Joseph Eichler that would, under any ordinary inspection, appear entirely legitimate. The name Joseph Eichler was not chosen at random. Investigation of Austrian population registers by Dr. Bergman's team at the University of Graz, working with the Austrian State Archive through October and November 2023, identifies a real Joseph Eichler, a Styrian farmer born in 1907 and killed during fighting on the Italian front in September 1944. The real Eichler had no surviving immediate family. His identity had been, in effect, abandoned by his death. Someone knew this and used it. The letters. The 12 letters addressed to Elsa, found in the satchel, presented investigators with their most emotionally complex and forensically significant discovery. But Elsa Brenner died in February 1944. These letters, all 12 of them, post-date her death. At least 3 of them clearly do, because they reference events that could not have been written before early 1944. One letter mentions the bombing of Nuremberg. Another references the Soviet summer offensive of 1944. The letters are undated, a deliberate omission, investigators believe, but their content can be partially sequenced through the events they describe. Dr. Huber's team conducted handwriting analysis comparing the letters to known samples of Brenner's handwriting from the official logbook and from a separate source, a 1942 internal technical memorandum bearing Brenner's signature, located in the Freiburg Federal Military Archive. The comparison, completed in March 2024, concluded with a high degree of probability that the letters and the logbook were written by the same hand. Brenner was writing letters to his dead wife. The content of the letters, translated from German by a team of historians at Vienna's Institute for Contemporary History, is not what one would expect from a fugitive officer planning an escape. They are, by turns, tender, sorrowful, and intensely self-justifying. Brenner writes about Werner and Ilse, the children he lost, with an anguish that runs through every sentence. He writes about a war he no longer believes in, and a Germany he describes in one passage as a country that has eaten its own children alive. He writes about what he calls the decision, never specifying what it is, with a mixture of resolve and self-reproach that reads like a man in dialogue with his own conscience. But most significantly for the investigation, one letter contains a passage that researchers initially found puzzling and then, upon closer examination, recognized as something else entirely, an encoded reference to a contact. The passage reads in translation, "I have spoken to the silversmith again. He assures me the clock will run properly once it is wound in the new city. The mechanism is Swiss, which means it will be reliable even in different weather." A silversmith who deals in Swiss mechanisms, a new city, an encoded communication using the language of clockwork, perhaps a deliberate reference to Brenner's wife's family background in clockmaking, a private code known only to the people it was intended to reach. The question investigators found themselves asking in April 2024 was, who was the silversmith and where was the new city? The descendants. On December 3, 2023, Dr. Altman's team, in coordination with the German Federal Archive and the Bavarian State Archive, located 2 living individuals with a familial connection to Friedrich Karl Brenner. The first is Karl-Heinz Brenner, 74, the son of Brenner's surviving younger brother Ernst, who died in 1998. The second is a woman identified in investigation documents only as Witness A resident of Munich in her late 60s, whose connection to the Brenner family is described in official investigation materials as through the female line, suggesting a possible connection to Elsa Brenner's surviving relatives. Karl-Heinz Brenner was contacted by investigators from the Austrian Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution in December 2023. He agreed to an interview and, crucially, to providing a DNA sample. The DNA comparison, run against biological material extracted from the Weihepass, involved analyzing organic cells transferred to document paper through handling, a technique pioneered in forensic document analysis over the past decade. Results returned in April 2024 confirmed a second-degree familial DNA match between the Weihepass material and Karl-Heinz Brenner's sample. The man who handled that service book repeatedly was, with a high degree of certainty, a biological relative of the Brenner family, and the only Brenner whose profile fit the document's stated identity was Friedrich Karl himself. Karl-Heinz Brenner's reaction, as described by investigators present at the session when results were shared, was one of prolonged silence followed by a single question: did he survive? The honest answer at that stage was, investigators believed so. The evidence, accumulating piece by piece through the autumn and winter of 2023 and into 2024, was pointing with increasing consistency toward a man who had not died over Poland in October 1944, a man who had spent months preparing an exit, a man who had walked out of the most destructive war in human history through a door he had built with his own hands. The bank records. In February 2024, responding to a formal international cooperation request filed by the Austrian Federal Criminal Investigation Office, Swiss financial regulators provided access to records from a now-defunct private banking institution that had operated in Basel from 1907 until its merger with a larger Swiss bank in 1978. The records, covering the period from 1945 through 1962, include an account registered in the name of Joseph Eichler, opened in January 1945 with an initial deposit equivalent, at historical conversion rates, to approximately 12,000 Swiss francs. The depositor is described in the account opening documentation as a civil engineer from Styria. The account was active until 1961. During that period, it recorded regular deposits and withdrawals consistent with a person living modestly but securely. In 1961, a final large withdrawal, clearing most of the account's remaining balance, was made in person at the Basel branch. The account was then dormant until its formal closure in 1964. The initial deposit amount is consistent with the liquidation value of approximately 6 kilograms of gold at early 1945 market rates. Joseph Eichler, whoever was using that name, had arrived in Switzerland in January 1945 with gold, with an identity, and with a plan. The escape of Friedrich Karl Brenner from the collapse of the Eastern Front was not, as investigators now understand, a purely individual achievement. What the evidence from the Styrian hangar, the Basel banking records, and 3 years of international archival research has collectively revealed is the partial outline of a network, not the large-scale, institutionally organized escape apparatus that historians have documented in the form of the so-called Odessa network, but something smaller, more selective, and in some ways more sophisticated. A network assembled from professional relationships, shared regional identity, and the particular opportunities offered by the Luftwaffe's administrative chaos in the final year of the war. The central node of this network, at least as it pertained to the Austrian corridor it operated through, was not Friedrich Karl Brenner. It was the man investigators have, after considerable cross-referencing, identified as the likely silversmith of Brenner's coded letter, a Viennese lawyer and former Abwehr, German military intelligence, contact officer named Dr. Rudolf Siebert, born in 1898, who appears in declassified Abwehr personnel files from 1942 as having maintained liaison contacts across the Austrian civil administration. Siebert survived the war and died in Vienna in 1971. He was never prosecuted. He was, by all appearances, a man who understood the immense value of discretion. But documents found in the estate archive of a Vienna law firm, whose senior partner had once been Siebert's associate, documents reviewed by Austrian archivists in 2024, following the Styrian hangar discovery, reveal that Siebert maintained a network of personal contacts across Switzerland, Argentina, and Spain from at least 1943 onward. He was, in the language of escape infrastructure, a facilitator. Reconstructed from the bank account evidence, the Basel registration records, cross-referenced with a partial route notation found in the back margin of the hangar's inner room, a faded pencil notation on the wall that investigators photographed and enhanced with hyperspectral imaging. Brenner's escape route from the Styrian hangar to Switzerland can now be traced with reasonable confidence across 5 waypoints. Waypoint 1. The Winkler Farm, southeast of Graz, October 1944 through January 1945. This is the hangar itself. Brenner spent an estimated 3 months concealed here, supported by the Winkler family. Anton Winkler, the registered owner, died in 1962 without leaving any documented account of this period. His son, Franz Winkler, who died in 1989, gave a single interview to a local historical society in 1975 in which he described the war years on the farm as complicated, but declined to elaborate. With the 2023 discovery, the reason for that reticence becomes apparent. Waypoint 2. A religious institution near Klagenfurt, January 1945. The pencil notation on the hangar wall includes what investigators have identified as the initials of a Corinthian monastery that, as documented by the Austrian State Archive, maintained connections to a Catholic aid network active in the region during the final months of the war. This network, originally established to assist civilians displaced by bombing, was, as has been documented in several post-war historical investigations, also used to facilitate the movement of individuals seeking to avoid Allied capture. The monastery's wartime records, reviewed by investigators in June 2024, contain a guest registry entry from January 12, 1945, listing a Joseph Eichler, civil engineer, as a beneficiary of overnight hospitality. Waypoint 3. A farmhouse near Villach, January to February 1945. Villach, in western Carinthia near the present-day border with Slovenia and Italy, was a transit hub for movement across multiple escape corridors during this period. A property record identifies a farmhouse used during this period by a man described in a 1946 Allied occupation-era witness statement as a Bavarian with technical knowledge who helped with mechanical repairs in exchange for accommodation. The witness, a local farmer interviewed by British military intelligence officers as part of a routine post-war screening, placed this individual at the Villach property from late January through mid-February 1945. Waypoint 4. Innsbruck, February 1945. The Tyrolean capital was, in the final months of the war, a city in administrative dissolution. The civilian identification system was functioning sporadically at best. A Joseph Eichler, matching the description on the Basel account opening documents, appears in a civilian food ration distribution record from the Innsbruck Municipal Archive dated February 28, 1945. The ration record, a routine administrative document that survived only because it was bundled with other food supply records transferred to the regional archive in the 1950s, lists the recipient's occupation as engineer and his place of last residence as Graz. Waypoint 5. Basel, Switzerland, arriving approximately January 1945 via a route through Liechtenstein. The Basel Bank account opening date suggests that Brenner, as Joseph Eichler, reached Switzerland in early 1945, likely crossing the border through Liechtenstein during the period of reduced frontier controls that characterized the final chaotic weeks of the war in the region. Once in Switzerland, he was beyond the reach of any German or Austrian authority. He was, legally and practically, Joseph Eichler. The scope of the network. How many others used this Austrian corridor? The evidence is incomplete, but suggestive. Siebert's Vienna archive documents reference contacts with at least 4 other individuals who, cross-referenced against German and Austrian war crime records, can be tentatively identified as former military and administrative officers. 2 of these appear in Argentine immigration records from 1946 and 1947 under names that match, with slight variations, the false identities suggested in Siebert's documents. One appears to be a former Gestapo regional officer from Vienna. Another is a former Wehrmacht logistics colonel. The Austrian corridor, as investigators have begun to call it, was small by the standards of the larger Odessa network but efficient. It moved people not by boat to South America but overland into Switzerland, from where they could access funds, acquire new travel documents through a second layer of forgery, and eventually disperse to Spain, Argentina, Egypt, or simply remain in Switzerland under continued false identities. The gold was the lubricant. Not everyone who moved through the network carried Reichsbank bars. Some paid in cash, in kind, in professional services. But gold was the universal currency of the network's facilitators, and the 23 bars found in the Styrian hangar represent, at current market value, an asset worth approximately €500,000. In 1944 terms, they represented a fortune sufficient to purchase years of anonymity. The last confirmed documentary trace of Friedrich Karl Brenner operating under the identity of Joseph Eichler is the Basel Bank account withdrawal in 1961. Between the account's opening in January 1945 and that final transaction 16 years later, the evidence yields a partial but coherent picture of a man who succeeded, against every statistical probability, in constructing a second life from the ruins of his first. The Swiss residency records, examined under the International Cooperation Request of 2024, show a Joseph Eichler registered as a resident of the canton of Basel-Land from March 1945 through mid-1947. His registered occupation, mechanical engineer. His declared employer for tax purposes is a small machine tool manufacturing company based in Liestal, a few kilometers southeast of Basel. Investigators contacted the successor entity to this company, a larger industrial firm that absorbed it in the 1960s, and the firm's archivist confirmed the existence of employment records for a Joseph Eichler, described in an internal skills assessment from 1946 as exceptionally knowledgeable in precision mechanics and aircraft engine systems. He was using the one skill set he actually had. He was hiding as himself, professionally speaking, simply under another name. In mid-1947, the Joseph Eichler residency registration in Basel-Land lapses. There is no forwarding address, no cancellation notice, and no death record. He simply stops being registered in Switzerland. The bank account remains active but shows reduced activity from 1947 onward, suggesting a pattern of less regular access, consistent with someone who has moved to another country but maintains the account for financial security. The next trace, and here the investigation enters its most speculative phase, though one grounded in real documentary evidence, comes from Argentina. The Argentine National Migration Directorate, responding to an international cooperation request submitted by the Austrian Federal Criminal Investigation Office in August 2024, confirmed the existence of an entry record for a Joseph Eichler, born 1907, nationality listed as Austrian, arriving at the port of Buenos Aires on September 14, 1947, aboard the Italian passenger vessel Giovanna Costa, which operated routes between Genoa and South America during the post-war decade, and is well documented in the historical literature as a vessel used by numerous European displaced persons, and, in several confirmed cases, Nazi-era fugitives during the late 1940s. The Argentine Joseph Eichler registered a residence in Córdoba province in October 1947. He appears in local municipal records twice, once in 1951, when he registered as a foreign national for the periodic census required of Argentine residents, and once in 1957, when a Joseph Eichler of the correct approximate age appears in a property transaction record for a small agricultural holding near the town of Villa Maria, roughly 150 kilometers south of Córdoba city. He was a farmer, or at least he was registered as one. But a detail buried in the 1951 census registration provides investigators with what they believe is their most direct connection between Joseph Eichler of Cordoba and Friedrich Karl Brenner of Rosenheim. Under the census field for previous occupation, the registrant lists Ingenieur, Luftfahrt, Engineer, Aviation. A Styrian farmer who happened to have been an aviation engineer. There are traces of letters. The investigation did not recover any correspondence from the Argentine period directly, but the coded letters found in the Styrian hangar satchel, the ones addressed to the dead Elsa, provide a template that investigators believe was continued. A researcher at the University of Buenos Aires, Dr. Maria Cecilia Fontana, working in collaboration with the Austrian investigation team from November 2024 onward, has identified in the archive of a German-language Argentine community newsletter from the Cordoba region a series of obituary notices from the 1960s and 1970s for individuals with German surnames. Among these, dated November 1968, is a notice for one Joseph Eichler, described as a beloved resident of the Villa Maria community, who passed quietly after a short illness at the age of approximately 61. No surviving family is listed. If this is Friedrich Karl Brenner, he died at 59, in a quiet agricultural community in central Argentina, 24 years after the Luftwaffe declared him killed in action over Poland. He never returned to Germany. He never, as far as any evidence suggests, made contact with the surviving members of his family. The letters to Elsa in the Styrian hangar are the last communication he left behind in any recoverable form. Witness A, the Munich resident contacted by investigators in December 2023, provided information, shared under conditions of anonymity, that adds one final human dimension to this story. She described receiving, as a child in the early 1960s, a package forwarded through an intermediary to her family, Elsa Brenner's surviving sister's family, containing a small photograph and a brief note. The photograph showed a middle-aged man standing in front of what appeared to be a house with a garden, squinting slightly into bright sunlight in an environment that looked warm and agricultural. The note in German said simply, "I am well. The children are always with me. Do not look for me." The photograph was not kept. No one thought to keep it. It was the 1960s. The war was something people wanted to forget, and a note from someone who said, "Do not look for me," was honored, consciously or not, by being lost. The discovery of the Styrian hangar and the subsequent 3-year investigation into the fate of Friedrich Karl Brenner confronts us with a moral and historical question that is, depending on where you stand, either very simple or immensely complicated. Friedrich Karl Brenner was not, as far as documented evidence can establish, a war criminal in the conventional legal sense. He does not appear in any Allied war crimes investigation file. He is not named in the proceedings of the Nuremberg trials or any of the subsequent Nuremberg military tribunals. There is no documented evidence that he participated in atrocities, ordered the killing of civilians, or administered any of the apparatus of racial persecution that characterized the Nazi state. He was, by all available accounts, a technically skilled military officer who served in the Luftwaffe, fought on the Eastern Front, maintained aircraft that dropped bombs and fired guns as part of a war of aggressive conquest and ideological extermination, but did not himself appear to have been a perpetrator of the crimes that placed so many of his contemporaries before tribunals. This is not, however, the same as innocence. He served a criminal state. He served it effectively and with distinction, receiving decorations for his contribution to a war machine whose purposes included genocide. His aircraft kept operational were flown in support of ground operations that included the systematic murder of the Jewish populations of Ukraine and Poland. The technical excellence he brought to his work made the Luftwaffe marginally more lethal for a marginally longer period. He was, in the language of post-war moral accounting, a cog, but a willing, skilled and thoroughly indispensable cog. And then, when the machinery broke apart around him and offered him an exit, he took it. He left. He left behind a country burning under the consequences of what he and millions of others had built. He left behind the possibility of accountability, of testimony, of whatever personal reckoning might have followed. He left behind the men and women and children who did not have a buried hangar, a reserve of smuggled gold, and a forged identity to walk away into. Is this a crime? Legally, in 1944, the act of deserting was a capital offense under German military law. Under the law of the victorious Allies, his escape was never adjudicated because he was never identified as a fugitive. Under the law of Argentina in 1947, he was simply an immigrant. Under no legal framework that ever applied to him was his survival in itself prosecuted. But there are the victims to consider. The families of Soviet soldiers and civilians killed by aircraft maintained at Brenner's operational efficiency. The people who did not survive the war, could not buy their way out of it, had no technical knowledge to trade for shelter and gold. The women and children of Nuremberg who died in the bombing raid that killed Elsa Brenner and her children, and whose killers, from the RAF Bomber Command, were likewise never prosecuted for those deaths in the swirling moral ambiguity of the war's aerial dimension. Justice, in the context of the Second World War, was always partial, always selective, and always too late for most of those who deserved it. Friedrich Karl Brenner's escape did not uniquely deprive any specific victim of a specific remedy. But it is one instance, among hundreds of documented and thousands of undocumented cases, of a man who participated in the machinery of the worst war in human history and lived out his days in the sunshine of an Argentine garden, unmolested by consequence. Karl-Heinz Brenner, the grandnephew who provided the DNA sample, offered investigators a measured response when the full picture of his relative's survival was eventually presented to him in a summary meeting in Vienna in June 2024. "I don't know whether to be relieved or ashamed," he said, according to the official case summary. "Perhaps both." His uncertainty feels appropriate. It is the appropriate response to a story that does not resolve cleanly into either heroism or villainy. The story of a man who chose his own survival over the demands of a history that had already taken everything from him. Whether that choice was understandable or unforgivable depends, as such judgments always do, on who is doing the judging and from which side of the loss. Today, in September 2025, the field southeast of Graz where the buried hangar was found stands in the early stages of preservation. The Styrian regional government, working in partnership with the Austrian Federal Office for the Protection of Monuments and a consortium of university historians, has declared the site a place of cultural and historical significance. A temporary protective structure covers the hangar entrance. The blast doors have been stabilized against further corrosion. The inner room, with its desk and its empty satchel, has been photographed, documented, and partially reconstructed in a preparatory exhibition currently being assembled for what will eventually become a permanent interpretive installation. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 inside, or what remains of it, which is the structural skeleton of an airframe from which all salvageable components were removed, presumably by Brenner himself during his months of occupancy, will be preserved in situ. The plan, as presented by the Austrian Ministry of Culture in a November 2024 announcement, is to create an interpretive memorial that addresses not only the specific case of Friedrich Karl Brenner, but the broader history of escape and evasion in the final phase of the war. The network of routes, the facilitators, the false identities, and the question of justice unresolved. The gold, 23 bars of it, cached behind fuel drums in the main bay, is subject to ongoing legal proceedings regarding ownership rights. Under Austrian law, items of historical significance found on private property enter a complex adjudication process involving the state, the landowner, and, where applicable, victims' restitution organizations. Given the likely origin of the gold in Reichsbank dispersal operations, the Austrian Jewish community has submitted a formal inquiry regarding potential restitution claims. That process will take years. The letters to Elsa sit in a climate-controlled case at the Institute of Forensic Science in Graz. They have been fully transcribed, translated, and analyzed. They are remarkable documents, not because they reveal dramatic secrets, but because they reveal an ordinary human interior in extraordinary circumstances. A man who lost his family, lost his faith in the cause he had served, and made the most private and consequential decision of his life alone, in the dark, in a buried room that the world had no idea existed. He was not the only one. That is perhaps the most haunting aspect of what the Styrian Hangar ultimately represents. For every escape that leaves behind a satchel, a logbook, and 23 gold bars to be discovered 81 years later, there are dozens that left behind nothing at all, that dissolved entirely into new identities, new countries, new lives, so thoroughly that not even the ground holds a record. Friedrich Karl Brenner died officially in the skis over Poland in October 1944. His name is on a memorial in Rosenheim. Visitors to that memorial walk past it without knowing that the man it commemorates was, at the moment of his official death, sitting in a buried room in Styria, writing letters to his dead wife by the light of a battery lamp, waiting for the war to end. He survived. He built a life from the ruins of the one he lost. He lived for another 24 years in the warmth of an Argentine provincial town under a name that was not his own. He died quietly in November 1968 and was noted in a community newsletter and then forgotten. And then, 81 years after the official record declared him gone, a technician named Marcus Felder looked at a ground-penetrating radar readout on a September afternoon and saw a void where the map said there was only Earth. The ground kept its secret for 8 decades. It took a routine engineering survey to finally ask the right question of the right field on the right day. History does not always reveal itself on a schedule. Sometimes it waits, patient and silent, 4.5 meters beneath the surface of a quiet Styrian farm, for someone to come along with the right instrument and the willingness to look. The question that the Styrian Hangar cannot answer, that no hangar, no satchel, no logbook ever fully answers, is how many other men made the same choice, built the same exit, and left no trace at all. How many sealed rooms are still down there, in the farms and forests and hillsides of a continent that spent a century trying to forget? How many logbooks are still sealed in oilcloth, waiting? Somewhere, in all probability, the ground is still keeping its secrets.